Welcome again to Commander's Tech, Weapons and Warfare in Context. Today, we're exploring some of the designs of one of the most important gun designers of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, and in so doing, checking out the most important development in conventional small arms of that period. Today, we're going to be talking about John Moses Browning and the development of machine guns. John Moses Browning was among the most prolific of gun designers, and his designs had a big impact. A multitude of sporting rifles and shotguns, the 1911 pistol and its whole family of semi-automatic pistols, the Browning automatic rifle that served so famously in both World Wars, and last but not least, a family of belt-fed heavy machine guns that still sees use more than a century later. Browning had an outsized influence on weapons design through the 20th century. But he was only one among many attempting to design a working, practical, fully automatic machine gun in the late 19th century. The first practical machine gun to enter use was the Gatling gun, designed in 1861 by Richard Jordan Gatling, which saw use in the U.S. Civil War as well as colonial and frontier conflicts through the turn of the century. It used multiple barrels revolving around a central axis with a mechanical loading, firing, and unloading system to feed cartridges from a hopper into each barrel in turn. A contemporary design, the Agar machine gun, also called the coffee mill gun, used a similar hand-cranked feed system with a single barrel. These guns were big and heavy, mounted on cannon-type carriages, and they were not very mobile. The theory of machine gunnery had not been developed yet, so these weapons were looked at as a species of artillery, generally as a replacement for grape shot or canister shot. Still, with a high chance of mechanical failure in the field, these early machine guns were not highly trusted by the soldiers, and acceptance was slow. Later, by the time of the Spanish-American War, somewhat smaller models of hand-cranked machine guns came into use, including the use of tripod mounts instead of cannon carriages. The increased portability allowed the weapons to be deployed for infantry support, instead of placed with the artillery. This allowed for the evolution of modern machine gun tactics, which saw further development during the First World War. After the Civil War, more manual machine guns were developed all over the world, from the French Raytheon Mitrailleuse to the British Gardner and Nordenfeld guns. They saw use, but also failures, and they needed the handle continuously cranked, or in the case of the Nordenfeld gun, the lever constantly worked, for the gun to continue firing. Many inventors saw the design of a true automatic machine gun as a lucrative goal. The three big names in the early development of true automatic weapons are Benjamin Hotchkiss, Hiram Maxim, and John Browning, all American inventors serving a primarily European market. The first to succeed at the goal of a fully automatic machine gun was Hiram Maxim, who developed and brought to market his gun in 1885. The Maxim gun revolutionized warfare in the colonial period, and again during the First World War. Early Maxim guns were fed by different feed systems like a hopper similar to the Gatling gun, and used black powder, primarily 5.77 450 Martini Henry in the British service, but used the recoil of the first cartridge to extract, eject, and reload the gun, allowing for continuous fire, or without manual operation. Black powder Maxims were subject to rapid fouling and generated plumes of smoke, obscuring vision, making them unpopular like the earlier hand-cranked machine guns had been. But soon, smokeless cartridges, along with belt feeding, came into use, and new models of Maxim led to the infamous couplet about colonial warfare. Whatever happens, we have got the Maxim gun, and they have not. Maxim guns were produced in many calibers, including 8mm Mauser, 7.62 by 54mm Russian, 30-06 Springfield, and 303 British. Copies and derivatives, including the MG08, the Vickers, and the PM1910, saw heavy use all over the world through the 1950s. And actually, even past that, there have been 1910 Maxim guns used in Ukraine. Benjamin Hotchkiss developed a revolving barrel cannon similar to an oversized Gatling gun in the 1870s, but it was more important for the firm that he established in France, which produced the Model 1897 automatic machine gun. The Hotchkiss machine gun was an air-cooled weapon with large cooling fins on the barrel and was gas-operated like modern automatic rifles. Instead of a belt or a hopper, it used rigid feed strips, typically holding 80 rounds of ammunition. Like the Maxim, this was a commercially produced weapon, and it was sold to many countries. And so, it was made in many different calibers. The Hotchkiss was adopted by the French Army in several variants, and the U.S. Army as the 1909 Bene Mercier machine gun. In addition, Imperial Japan based most of their heavy and even light machine guns on the Hotchkiss design. John Browning began working on a machine gun design in 1889, but it wasn't until 1892 that he had a patentable design, which became the Model 1895 automatic machine gun, which was then sold to Colt for production and marketing. This was another commercial design, and was produced in several calibers, but most notably in 30-40 Krag, 6mm Lee Navy, and 30-06 Springfield. The 1895 is air-cooled and gas-operated, but due to its swinging operating lever under the barrel, it came to be known as the potato digger. It saw service with volunteer units in the Spanish-American War, notably with the Rough Riders, and it was sold around the world. Due to the design being air-cooled, the gun had heat issues, which would cause it to seize up during sustained fire. As a result, by World War I, it was largely relegated to a training weapon for the U.S. military purposes, or it was used by National Guard units domestically. Later, the design was sold to Marlin, who produced an improved model, the 1917, which fixed some of the issues and saw service as an aircraft and tank machine gun during the interwar period. Still, it remains an interesting footnote to the much more successful machine guns Browning later developed. In response to the demands of the First World War, as well as to correct some of the deficiencies in the Model 1895, Browning designed a recoil-operated, water-cooled, belt-fed machine gun. While externally similar to the Maxim, Browning's design had the same pistol grip as the Model 1895, instead of the spade grips and butterfly trigger of the Maxim. More importantly, the Browning water-cooled gun, the Model 1917, has a vastly simpler internal design than the Maxim, with a bolt and firing pin assembly more akin to modern assault rifles. The 1917 turned out to be a rugged, reliable, and an overall excellent design. They saw some use at the end of World War I, and then they were produced commercially by Colt for sale all over the world once again, particularly popular in South America and in Poland. In World War II in Korea, they were still in common use by the U.S. Army and were also provided Lend-Lease to the UK and to many other countries. In addition to the 1917, Browning saw the need for a light machine gun by U.S. forces in France. The French 1915 Chouchou was not up to standard. For this role, particularly walking fire in support of infantry advances, Browning designed an automatic rifle, the famed BAR. The BAR is essentially a large, heavy 30-06 rifle firing fully automatic using a gas-operated mechanism loading from 20-round detachable box magazines. As an automatic rifle, as opposed to a true light machine gun, the barrel was not easily changeable, limiting its use for sustained fire. But still, the BAR remains well loved. After the war, the BAR was produced commercially as the Colt Monitor. Intended for civilian sale, the Monitor was prohibitively expensive, approximately $3,000 in the 1920s, limiting its interest to government sales, which with some stolen by the gangsters, particularly famously by Clyde Barrow. Variants were also produced by F.N. Herstal during the interwar period, and were used by several nations, including Poland and Belgium. The BAR remained in U.S. service through Korea, being retired in the mid-1950s prior to the adoption of the M60 general-purpose machine gun. After World War I, Browning in the U.S. military saw the need for a weapon similar to the 1917, but more portable. To accomplish this, Browning created the Model 1919 air-cooled machine gun. The 1919 was considered a light machine gun by the Army, but by most standards would be a heavy machine gun, as it was belt-fed, tripod-mounted, and crew-served. In fact, the 1919 is almost exactly the same as the 1917, and shares a surprising amount of parts interchangeability. The 1919 has a heavy barrel with a perforated barrel shroud to manage heat without the water jacket. And as a result, the sights are positioned a little differently than on the 1917. But otherwise, the receiver, bolt, and operating mechanism is largely identical. The 1919, in addition to being a highly successful infantry support weapon, saw widespread use in variations as an aircraft machine gun and as a tanker machine gun. Big brother in many ways to the 1917 and the 1919 is the M2 50 caliber machine gun. This legendary weapon is essentially a scaled-up 1919 in 50 caliber BMG. It has been in service since the early 1920s, and it is still in use today in aircraft, tank, naval, fixed emplacement, and infantry support roles. The M2, as a heavy support weapon, is a little too big to be readily moved, although a crew can disassemble and move one fairly quickly when called for. Thank you for listening today. If you haven't already, remember to subscribe and like. And in our next video, we're going to be looking a little closer at the 1919, getting into its mechanism and its operation, as well as discuss its role on the battlefield and the role of similar machine guns on the battlefield, including looking at things like indirect fire. And in the near future, we'll also include Also take this thing out to the range and get a look at how it actually operates.